All right, perfect. All right. Hi, and welcome to this evening's session, maybe tonight's session, depending on what time zone you're currently in, on researching beyond the binary, LGBTQIA plus communities. This is actually kind of the midpoint of the Context event series, which is basically a series of events that work to advance our discussions, our thoughts, our knowledge about research, especially when it comes to diverse populations, when we're talking about Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, also known as BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, which is definitely going to be the focus of tonight, women's health, anything like that, and ultimately coming with a lens of intersectionality in terms of recognizing that a lot of these experiences, issues, challenges, disparities that we're often trying to articulate, trying to understand are in many ways interconnected with each other. They all kind of shape and form each other in different ways. So that will always be kind of like the underlying theme of each of these sessions, even though this session, again, is going to focus more on gender and sexual diversities. It's ultimately still going to come back in different ways about how this relates back to racial diversity. How does this relate to socioeconomic issues or other types of um, uh, problems that we have to kind of resolve, especially as evidence-based practitioners, as researchers and professionals. So yeah, and luckily this, even though that seems pretty daunting in terms of the aim of this session, it's a very introductory kind of level. I definitely wanted to build this as more of a starting point for a lot of people who may not necessarily have a lot of, say, built-in knowledge about a lot of the topics that we might be addressing here, a lot of the terminology that we're going to be discussing. So we'll introduce that, but then also hopefully have some conversations about how can we go beyond that as well, put it into practice and application. So one of the things I do want to stress at this point, even though I'm the one mainly talking and I'm kind of like the main presenter at this point, I do want to stress that this is definitely an interactive type of session. You can totally participate in the chat. You can participate by unmuting yourself at any point. Even if I'm in the middle of talking about something, if you want to clarify something or add your own perspective or thoughts, by all means do so. I think that's really the best way that we're going to really add to the enrichment of knowledge among all of us. Share that knowledge. Because I'm definitely not the end-all be-all authority when it comes to these type of themes. I'm really just kind of providing my own contributions to it and hopefully providing some sort of space to where we can really discuss these things. So yeah, and then there'll also be a short activity at some point in the session. I can't remember where, but it will eventually come across. So yeah, and let's enjoy this. So I'm going to move on to our next slide here. So a little bit of housekeeping as well. There is a contest going on actually with iLearn since it has recently launched for students. So basically by attending our events, you are increasing your chances of making a win for one of 6 gift cards, I believe. I think they're $50 gift cards. And basically all you have to do is attend a session like this and ultimately also on your Ring Central display showing your name, basically your first and last name. That way we can follow up with you at some point and put you into the drawing. So yeah, I think this contest is running until the end of March. So feel free to attend other sessions like this or, other ones that are very different from this one. And yeah, increase your chances. I hope your name gets drawn nice. So let's see. So another thing too is that I've done this for pretty much every session I've done for context in terms of providing kind of like a transparency disclosure. I haven't come up with a better name for it, honestly, and I haven't seen anything else about it, but ultimately kind of providing some transparency about who I am, especially as the presenter, because I think that's really important, especially when, as librarians, we're teaching our our students and even our faculty on how to evaluate information that's being presented to them. And I think presentations, these type of verbal presentations are one such piece of information that you should critically evaluate, especially from whom it's being provided by, and so on. So this is my way of kind of doing that, so you can evaluate on your own the expertise that I'm hopefully providing, and so on, but also being aware that there may be certain biases, even the ones I'm not necessarily aware of. And that's why I also like to have a much more interactive session. That way we can provide a much more rich and diverse sharing of knowledge, because like I said, this shouldn't be your end-all be-all type of session to where you know everything about LGBTQIA's topics just because you attended this session. By all means, this is not going to be exhaustive. But yeah, so my name is Matthew Chase. I'm the librarian at the San Marcos campus. So not only do I have an academic background in librarianship, which probably comes, of course, as being a librarian, but I also have a background in sociology. So this is actually where I kind of got originally passionate about these type of issues and a lot of these experiences and the populations that we're hoping to support. And so a lot of my knowledge in this regard is going to be kind of built on that, on my existing knowledge of sociology and social theories, especially like in terms of intersectionality. And later on, we're going to talk a little bit about queer theory as well. And ultimately, a lot of those social theories are actually kind of getting more and more incorporation in health sciences and other types of academic fields, which is kind of exciting. So it kind of provided me a nice way to apply that knowledge that I have and share it with you all here. But yeah, another thing to disclose is I am a white USian. So yeah, I am a occupant of the United States in that regard. It does look like I have a typo in the next bullet, but essentially I'm a cisgender male, heterosexual, heteromantic, and we can discuss a lot of that different terminology that I put out there. But essentially what it means by cisgender, it means that I identify as a male, and which was also the gender and sex that I was assigned with at birth. And I'm also heterosexual, heteromantic. So I'm pretty much, yeah, it shows like sexual attraction and romantic attraction to the so-called opposite gender, even though by opposite, we're going to kind of discuss that as well. But a really convenient abbreviation that I've come across is cishet, which I really like because it's a lot better than trying to say cisgender male, heterosexual, heteromantic. My pronouns are he, him, his. And lastly, I'm a critical optimist. I really kind of just wanted to stress this point in terms of where I'm coming from with a lot of the knowledge I'm hoping to share, why I was coordinating this particular event and the other events in context. But ultimately, as an optimist, I do think that things can get better. I don't think we are necessarily stuck where we're at, or that things are as they are, and there's nothing to change about that. I think there's always going to be opportunities for us to progress and to get better and to hopefully improve the quality of life for everyone. But I'm also critical about that, like in terms of like, how are we measuring that type of progress? How are we getting better, and who's getting better and who's getting potentially left behind? And what voices are not necessarily being represented in our pursuit for optimism and progress. So with that, I'll move on. Another kind of level of context I wanted to provide here in terms of why this type of session matters, or why we should even discuss these type of topics. So I kind of want to outline a few points here that I've come across in scholarly literature to kind of demonstrate the importance of discussing these type of topics, especially when it comes to LGBTQIA plus communities. One of which is how LGBTQIA plus patients are often reluctant to disclose their sexual orientation to a healthcare professional due to fear of discrimination, unequal care, and other negative patient-practitioner interactions. And even though this particular finding kind of focuses more on sexual orientation and so on, it definitely applies to gender as well. There's many patients who may not want to disclose about their gender identity for different reasons, but it can definitely be contributed by experiences or fears of discriminatory behaviors from their clinician or professionals. And one thing to also kind of note, and this is something I also stressed when we were talking about anti-racist research, is connecting how poor health outcomes within, in this case, LGBTQIA plus communities are linked to experiences of stigma and discrimination. And I think this is such an important thing to note because a lot of the times when we talk about health, it's often kind of conceptualized as a very individual aspect of ourselves, that it's ultimately our responsibility as to how our health is. At least that's kind of like the very Euro-American Western type of perspective. But ultimately what we're finding instead is that, especially with diverse populations, especially within the LGBTQIA, within BIPOC communities and everything in between, there is these solid links between their own health and to greater structural issues that are happening in terms of their access to certain services, where they live or where they can live, and so on. And their just overall experiences, as we talked about with discrimination, unequal care, and so on. And there's even some literature showing about how even structural components within the health system itself, the healthcare system, continue to pathologize transgender identities and other types of LGBTQIA plus identities. And in this case, one was identifying how ICD codes continue to pathologize. Even as they get updated, they continue to have legacies of pathology. And then we also have at the very end, kind of a little bit more of a more positive note, is how educational programs can be effective at increasing student and professional knowledge about the LGBTQ communities and LGBTQ related healthcare. I definitely think this is, again, kind of that part of that optimistic part of it in terms of how educational programs, hopefully something like this workshop here, can help to contribute to our, again, our greater understanding, our greater knowledge, and our greater compassion for these communities. But again, we'll have to really kind of question is like how much education can we develop, and then like ultimately is that being applied into our actual actions as researchers, as professionals, and so on. So, is education enough by itself? Oh yeah, so kind of fast forward actually, I thought I had a slide before this, but actually I was going to do kind of like a preemptive talk about like, well, how exactly then are we supposed to frame our research in a way that values and prioritizes the needs of LGBTQIA plus communities and their voices and their experiences, and making sure that they're being kind of heard. Because unfortunately, one of the other points that I didn't add into the last slide is that there is a tremendous underrepresentation of LGBTQIA plus communities in clinical research, especially like randomized control trials and so on. There's definitely barriers that have prevented LGBTQIA plus communities from even participating. But another problem, and we can even talk about this even further, is even if they are being included, are we really articulating that data? Are we really collecting it at all? And so ultimately, we really kind of have to get those questions. And a way to frame that kind of approach, that questioning approach to how research has been used to both support LGBTQIA plus communities as well as maybe leave them behind in certain circumstances. We definitely need some sort of like framework to kind of go off of. There's definitely a lot of frameworks to talk about. Intersectionality is definitely one, and it was in a previous workshop that I kind of talked about, but we'll definitely be tying that in as an overall kind of lens. But more specifically, we could also apply another theoretical lens known as queer theory. So queer theory kind of arose in the 1990s, mainly due to a lot of activism That was in part to LGBTQIA plus issues and concerns at the time, especially when it came to like AIDS and so on. And ultimately their access to healthcare and other types of healthcare services and so on. So yeah, definitely appropriate here to talk about, especially as a health sciences university, is maybe that queer theory can provide that certain framework for us to start asking these questions and really take a look, a much more critical look at ourselves as researchers and our work through research. One of the main principles of queer theory is that it decenters heteronormativity and cisnormativity. Heteronormativity is basically the idea that heterosexuality is the norm and no other way to kind of describe it. Essentially talking about how heterosexuality is normal and kind of the preferred ideal of any type of relationship, whether it's like romantic or sexual in any way. And ultimately providing any other types of relationships, especially when we talk about like same sex, same gender type of relationships, or gay and lesbian populations, and ultimately their identities as the abnormal, the aberration, and ultimately invalid. And the same also applies to cisnormativity, which actually refers more to the gender aspect of this, while heteronormativity kind of referred to the sexual diversity or lack thereof in heteronormativity. Cisnormativity addresses a very specific worldview of how gender is supposed to be. Basically, with the assertion that gender is in two aspects, male and female, so kind of a very binary framework. And that anything beyond that is, again, abnormal, aberrant, and ultimately just not valid or valuable in any capacity. And I guess in the health sciences context for both of these, pathological. And so ultimately, the second point to queer theory that it contests these assumptions that we have that gender and sexuality are exclusively biological. As we'll talk about in a bit, is that that's not really the case. But oftentimes, especially within medical research and health sciences research, historically and contemporarily have continued to solidify this idea that gender and sexuality are biological factors and nothing more. But we really need to kind of consider, the social implications of how gender and sexuality and our experiences with them are kind of formed and shaped by others and, the greater society and so on. And then third point is that it challenges that, again, that binary framing of gender and sexuality as like in a either or oppositional type of standpoint. Again, that male or female, but often it's not just male or female, it's like male versus female or anything like that. So again, trying to get away from that very limited, very narrowed type of framing of gender and sexuality and kind of just being a lot more inclusive of the other types of lived experiences beyond that. Because what we'll talk about is that even within the binary of male and female or heterosexuality, are they really as fixed and unchanging? And we're actually going to talk about that in a bit. But ultimately, again, with that fourth point, it applies an intersectionality lens. I think what we can't forget is even though we are focusing on gender and sexual diversities, we can't also forget that those same diversities shape and inform our experiences when it comes to racial diversity, when it comes to socioeconomic diversity, or challenges or disparities, and a whole host of other types of sites to where we have different types of experiences, whether they're very privileged, maybe we have certain access to certain things because of how we identify, versus having maybe some barriers or challenges depending on how else we identify. And ultimately, we have these kind of overlapping identities that give us some privileges in some sense, maybe in some situations, but not necessarily all. And then maybe some barriers or challenges in other circumstances. So hopefully that kind of, again, queer theory is a really huge kind of theoretical lens, and I'm not going to have nearly enough time to really cover everything about it. I would probably need a whole other 2 workshops just to kind of cover the theoretical premises, but hopefully that kind of gives you a good introduction, at least, kind of like set the pace. And if you ever are curious about learning more about queer theory, I actually have a listing of readings that are accessible through the library as well as outside of it, in case you're ever interested. So you can always, email me or anything like that, and be more than happy to provide that. But yeah, at this point, I kind of want to take a moment, because I know we kind of went into a lot, and see if there was any questions, any perspectives, anything like that. Maybe you've heard of queer theory, and maybe you have anything to add to it as well, or maybe it's new to you, and how do you feel about it at the moment? You can also, oh, go for it. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that this is like 100% new to me. I'd never heard of it before.
Sure.
I will definitely email you for that reading list, because I'm very interested in it. And I don't know why, but I was kind of shocked when you said that they're lacking in like randomized control trials. I don't know why I'm like surprised by that fact, but I was.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's definitely a surprising fact, and especially because we have such high value to like randomized control trials and other types of similar levels of evidence that have these like very high levels of like rigor and to the methodology and so on. But yeah, unfortunately, yeah, there's been actually a lot of studies that have shown that even within racial diversity, there's a tremendous lack of representation, to the point that a lot of clinical evidence that we're kind of using as evidence-based practitioners is really kind of based on samples that are relatively homogenous. And by homogenous, I mean that they're primarily of white cisgender male populations. So ultimately, as an evidence-based practitioner, then you would have to ask yourself, well, if I'm using this evidence to treat a patient, is it really treating the patient that's in front of me, like in terms of that, or is it treating this like this certain image of a patient that is white cisgender male? And there might be certain needs or cultural differences or any other aspects that maybe we're kind of missing out on because of that, because we're not getting those nuances, for sure. And yeah, definitely feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to share the reading. Actually, a faculty recently asked me for it, so I have it all, at the ready to share. But yeah, let's see. I see in the comments, I don't have any questions at this point, but I agree with Chelsea. I hadn't considered that with our CTs, especially how much goes into the experimental nature. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they've been applying different types of, like in terms of the studies that have revealed those gaps, mainly it's, there's issues of just barriers, so like in terms of socioeconomic factors. Maybe a lot of like trans folk aren't able to participate in the RCTs for very long. Even if they do initially join, they won't be able to attend all the sessions and such. Or throughout the entire study, just for like financial reasons and such, because ultimately with trans folk and LGBTQIA, they can be much more likely to experience like financial hardships just for, the experiences that they have. And that also just applies to a whole range of other diversities when we're talking about race, with Black, Indigenous, people of color. And then it's even more hardships, especially for queer or trans or non-binary or gay, BIPOC, for sure. So all those kind of overlapping factors. But another question that also gets raised is, even if they do get included, how is the data accurately representing them? And we're going to talk about that actually in terms of like, when we do ask about like questions of what is your gender, what options are we providing them in terms of the multiple choice? So we can talk about that in a bit too. But before we go into that, I just kind of want to give another quick overview of just the full breadth and scope of gender and sexual diversities. And there's a whole range of different descriptions on like, you know, the different aspects of gender and sexuality. But the one I found that has the best introductory approach to this is the genderbread person. Which is fortunately a public domain educational tool that was provided, which is awesome. But yeah, this kind of shows like just the different dimensions to what, you know, composites our own sexual and gender identities and experiences and so on. Basically, for this particular kind of infographic, it kind of shows how there's dimensions of gender identity, gender expression, anatomical sex, sexual attraction, romantic attraction, and ultimately distinguishing them all as being very different from each other in different ways. Now, yes, we can have anatomical sex in terms of like genitalia and so on, but ultimately it can inform, but is ultimately still in some ways separate from how we conceptualize our own identity in terms of gender, or how we express that gender through our clothing, and other types of, you know, behaviors that we kind of do to kind of reinforce like, no, I'm this. And then also even our ultimately our sexuality when it comes to being sexually attracted or romantically attracted. And ultimately too is, as you can see with these like bars here, is that you can either be like fully femaleness when it comes to anatomical sex, or you can be none at all and be completely focused on male, or you can be a combination, which is definitely with like intersexed populations, for example, who have anatomical sex features that share both femaleness and maleness, or there could be none at all. And then there's also like gender expression that you can fully express as feminine, or you can fully express as masculine, or maybe a mix of the two, or maybe in certain contexts you're very feminine in some ways and very masculine in others, or you just don't abide by either. The same goes for any of all these other types of categories. And then we also provide a separation for sex assigned at birth, kind of like what I was describing with my own self when I was saying I'm cisgender, meaning that I agree or my identity abides by the same sex or gender that I was assigned at birth. In this case, cisgender male. But for a lot of people who might be like intersex, you know, decades before, and I think even now there's been issues about it, is that a lot of kids are not necessarily assigned as intersex, even though that would probably be the accurate anatomical identity, but maybe they have to instead get assigned female or male, depending on the decisions of the clinician or the patient, or I'm sorry, the parent. But yeah. So it just kind of like talks about the full extent, full scope and breadth of all these different factors. And ultimately, one of the things I kind of wanted to raise here is, are all these different factors getting measured when we're doing research? Like I said, when we're talking about like, what is your gender and anything like that, are we really accommodating for all these different aspects to it? And if so, that's awesome, and maybe we should see those type of models, or if not, then maybe we need to work on that for sure. So yeah, let's see, we're at the halfway mark. That's awesome. So I do have a short little activity here just to kind of see if, you know, as kind of like a vocabulary check-in, to really just clarify our understanding about foundational LGBTQIA plus related vocabulary, especially like I said, this is kind of like an introductory type of session. So I wanted everyone to kind of still be on the same page, because everyone's going to have different levels of knowledge and experiences with any of these, a whole assortment of different terminology. And honestly, with this short activity, we're not going to necessarily cover all of them. There's way too many, and it keeps building. That's the awesome thing about it, is that these the terminology and the vocabulary that we're trying to develop in regards to understanding our gender and sexual diversity continues to change. So there's really not really like an exhaustive resource on that, but I can share one for sure in a moment. but let's see. Let me just load up this activity really quick. So I'll give you a moment if you'd like to log into mentee.com. I'll actually provide the link in the chat. It's probably the easiest way. But you can also do it in the chat if you feel more comfortable, or just it just works out better for you. But yeah, essentially what I would like you to kind of identify is any terminology that you would like to kind of learn a little bit more about. I do have a couple definitions for each of these to kind of give you some a little bit more information and awareness about what they are and what they represent. But yeah, so feel free to join in. I'll give you a minute. Let's see, TwoSpirit, I see that. Cool. Zer, okay. I said Zer, but honestly, there's been differences with that. I've heard Zer and I've heard Zir for that. Genderqueer, intersex, okay, cool. Let's start with those then. So the first one that I saw was TwoSpirit. So this is kind of relating back to the idea of intersectionality that we also need to consider about like racial diversity and all that. TwoSpirit is actually a term within a very specific LGBTQIA plus community within the Native American populations. So it's actually been, it was more historically used to refer to Native Americans who had a very dual gender kind of a spirit. Like they had a very masculine spirit and as well as a very feminine spirit that were existing within themselves. But that has recently changed. It was actually kind of disappeared after a while, a lot due to assimilation policies and colonialist practices, especially with boarding schools, Indian boarding schools. So a lot of the belief systems with it got lost in some ways, but it actually has made its own return, especially within the LGBTQIA plus communities, especially within Native Americans, who kind of reclaimed it as a way of identifying that they have basically a bi-gender identity, meaning that they are both male and female, or in some mixture and combination of both. So it was kind of like becoming its own gender identity in that sense. One thing that's kind of stressed though is that even though I said Native American communities, I don't necessarily mean all Native American communities adhere to the TwoSpirit identity. As far as I was aware and kind of like from what I learned is that it's only within certain Native American communities. And I think oftentimes, unfortunately, with Native American identities, they tend to get very joined up and grouped in ways that are like not really accurate because each Native American tribe has way different cultural practices and beliefs and so on. So, oh, it only lets you choose one option. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I think I didn't adjust the setting correctly with that, but thanks for letting me know for next time for sure. But yeah, so that's essentially what TwoSpirit is essentially referring to. It's actually a terminology that's been reclaimed within certain Native American individuals and communities and tribes. The other one I saw was Z and Zir. Again, I've heard Zer and I've also heard Zir. I think Zir is probably a little bit more accurate. But essentially it's actually another alternative pronoun that's been recently developed. Oftentimes we hear like he, him, or we hear she, her as those traditional binary pronouns, but we've also seen they, them as being kind of a more inclusive, more general, and also more accommodating for like non-binary folk who don't identify with either male or female. But Z and Zir have actually kind of emerged in its own way. In a way, it's kind of just like the equivalent to they, them, but it's just another alternative to that. So not everyone kind of adheres to Z, Zir, but if they do identify themselves, at least you'll know that's another pronoun that's been manifesting recently. So genderqueer. So essentially genderqueer is actually just referring to people who, it's become actually more of an umbrella term for a lot of different things, but ultimately it's just kind of talking about any folks who don't necessarily subscribe to one gender or another. They may have just a mixture of different types of gender identities. It might be within the binary of like male and female, so a combination, very similar to like TwoSpirit. But it could also be people who like also identify as just multiple different types of identities within the gender spectrum. So really it has a lot of malleability, a lot of flexibility. So it kind of depends on who you're talking to, but oftentimes that's kind of the general gist of what genderqueer represents. Intersex, that's actually a really relevant one, especially within medical and clinical contexts. It was actually historically known as hermaphrodite, which is actually more of a derogatory phrasing at this point. So no one uses it, or you shouldn't really at this point. Intersex has actually become the accepted terminology within intersexed populations. But yeah, it's essentially referring to people who have multiple anatomical sex characteristics that reflect femaleness and well as maleness. So just people who have maybe shared genitalia of male and female or so on. But again, it's been a very controversial, not in the sense like intersex people themselves are controversial, it's the practices that have been kind of upheld, especially within the health sciences and healthcare systems regarding intersexed individuals, especially when they're born. A lot of times the normal practice was to surgically make them to be male or female, but not a share of both. More recently, it's been more of a practice to allow the child, when they grow up, to kind of decide where they want to go, if they want to remain intersexed or if they feel more familiarity or more comfort with being male or female or any other gender identity that they would like to identify with. So yeah, so that's kind of the terminology there when it comes to intersex. But yeah, the archaic version was hermaphrodite, but that kind of arose from like centuries of like misconceptions of what intersexed individuals were, especially as deviants or deformities and so on. So we no longer subscribe to hermaphrodite. We use intersex instead. But yeah, any questions or anything like that? Any comments, thoughts to share here? In the meantime, can you go over asexual? Sure, yeah, asexual is essentially referring to people who are not sexually attracted to anyone. They basically just don't have any sexual attraction to any gender, to any person. So yeah, that's kind of like the general thing, but there is a misconception about asexual and aromantic. There's definitely a difference. For people who are aromantic, it means that you don't have any romantic attraction, but they can still have sexual attraction. For asexual, they can have romantic attractions, but not necessarily, but they don't have any sexual attraction to any person. Yeah, I think that clarifies what that means. But yeah, so and oftentimes, unfortunately, they do get missed out on in discussions about sexuality and gender. So yeah, definitely a population that we need to pay closer attention to, for sure. Actually, a fun fact is that if you are among like asexual persons, a lot of times they may colloquially call themselves ACE, which is basically just an abbreviated version of asexual. And then for aromantic, they call themselves aro. So that's just like a shortened phrase. So, but yeah, let's see. I see in the comments. I may have missed this. Is there a specific Native American that follow TwoSpirit, Native American groups? Not necessarily. I mean, there's just been different groups and communities. I don't recall any specific tribes that have practiced it. It seems to be more just a growing movement within Native American LGBTQIA plus communities to kind of just reclaim it. But it has been a terminology and concept that has been shared among different types of tribes historically as well. So, but unfortunately, I really can't name a specific tribe, which I need to correct for sure next time. But yeah, great questions. But yeah, so basically, I just kind of wanted to provide this activity as well as kind of the different dimensions to gender and sexuality, really just kind of emphasize that we probably need to have a way better understanding of just the scope and the breadth of these different identities that we're talking about, and experiences and voices, and be much more inclusive of them when we're actually talking about them in the research, especially for anyone such as like myself, say like as a cisgender heterosexual heteromantic. If I'm as a researcher and I'm studying these type of populations, what ultimately kind of story am I writing about them? Like, because ultimately as a researcher, I get to decide the final write-up of any study that I do. I get to design the methodology, I get to design the question, I get to design what data I get to analyze, and ultimately, again, like that final write-up in the interpretations, which kind of raises a lot of questions about our own sense of like how science is supposed to be objective or purely kind of separated from the community that we're looking at. But ultimately, our study could really inform or harm this community's support networks, especially because maybe our research gets picked up in the news, and maybe there's now a new story or narrative being circulated about this community for potential good, potential ill, maybe a mix of both. So we really just have to be a lot more aware about that and our own kind of like privileged standpoint in that regard. So with that, if you want, if you're on Mentee, you can also click on this link. It basically has a comprehensive list of similar vocabulary and its definitions, in case you're interested. They actually put an asterisk for comprehensive because it doesn't necessarily, it's not exhaustive. And they wanted to kind of stress that it's continually evolving, continually being changed. And even some of these terminologies mean different things depending on who you're talking to. So, but it's always important to respect the individual person that you're talking to, whether as a research participant or as a patient, and really respect how they're identifying, which I think is kind of a key lesson here too. But I'm going to move back into the main PowerPoint here. So just some important things to kind of consider when we're doing research. Is first of all, phrasing our research question in a way that's inclusive. Ultimately, just asking ourselves, does your question reflect the identities and experiences of your patient or community? And as we saw, there's a whole breadth of different identities that maybe we're not necessarily aware of, but maybe if we really kind of have deeper conversations with our patient and maybe even involving them in the research process, ideally that would be the case, and really allowing them to have some sort of role in how your question's being phrased. Because ultimately your question's really going to shape where you go with the study design, the methodology, the data analysis, the theoretical lens that you're either affirming or contesting or anything like that, and ultimately the final write-up. And actually, one of the things to stress is actually PICO, even though we kind of teach students on this like the very first term, is actually a very useful search strategy for this. Mainly because PICO actually accommodates for patient population keywords. And so in that way, it can help you be a lot more inclusive in your evidence-based practices in that sense. It's actually been something I've been kind of incorporating more and more with my kind of introductory workshops with students, especially when they're starting to learn about research or, you know, looking for evidence and so on. But yeah, and then ultimately really asking ourselves, what demographic information are we collecting from our patients or research participants? And something I've been kind of alluding to consistently throughout this session is what questions are we asking our research subjects when it comes to that? And especially like what options are we providing them for their answers, especially when we say like, you know, what gender do you identify? It may be just limited to male, female, other. And even though other might be a common name for all these inclusive, identities and so on, but we're not getting that nuance. We're not actually seeing the representation there, because ultimately all of these different identities and populations and communities have way different experiences from each other. So there's a lot of diversity within the LGBTQIA plus communities that simply having other doesn't really help in that sense, help us understand. And then also we need to ask ourselves, how are scholarly databases organizing and categorizing evidence-based information? And this is actually something of a really important topic that I like to talk about a lot, especially when it comes to the biases that are embedded in scholarly databases, which we depend on as evidence-based practitioners and researchers. Even though they're great at helping us locate this information, there are some limits for sure. And one example is actually with PubMed, which I'll show right here. So actually with PubMed, there's an actual language to how the database works, the language that it uses to identify, to label, to categorize and organize information based on what kind of populations are being represented. And this also applies to Black, Indigenous people of color, and so on as well. But I wanted to kind of show like the evolution of how the language of PubMed has been changing, especially when it comes to medical subject headings, which are essentially, it's a vocabulary that the developers and designers and managers of PubMed use to classify studies based on what they're looking at. So if any studies that were particularly focusing on LGBTQIA plus communities in some way, they'll probably be labeled with one of these particular subject headings. And it helps you as a researcher to actually know them, because you can actually find research a lot more reliably, especially if you're doing like a systematic review, a scoping review of any sort. But originally, back when PubMed was initially starting in the 1960s, really the only terminology that was available was transsexualism, which at this point has become incredibly outdated, inaccurate, and in a lot of ways offensive to many LGBTQIA plus communities, especially within the transgender communities. And it's only until 1988 that another terminology came about, which is bisexuality, which again only accommodates for any folks that are just sexually attracted to both male and female genders. And then ultimately in 1995 with homosexuality for female and male. Again, you see those gender limitations, but also homosexuality has a very deeply controversial history, because it was often used as a mental health diagnosis. Or particularly mental illness diagnosis. And so in that way it was used by clinicians and evidence-based practitioners in a very kind of derogatory way. And at this point, even LGBTQIA plus communities have moved away from the term homosexual or homosexuality because of those roots in the term. Again, that pathologizing type of framework. And only more recently have we seen terminology like transgender persons, sexual and gender minorities, intersex persons. So we're getting a little bit better, but it has taken quite a while. And the problem too is that if you use the more recent terms, you're not actually going to see a lot of the research that was done before, say like transgender persons. You're only going to see the research from 2016 to the present. None of these labels, like more recently applied labels, will be used for previous research in the past. So you have to potentially use offensive or outdated terminology in order to find older works of literature. So definitely some limitations there. And then ultimately, too, is even when you find the research that actually hopefully addresses LGBTQIA plus communities, or maybe you just find general studies that talk about them in some way, it's important to query your critical appraisal of the evidence. Again, kind of really looking at the methodology, what kind of questions were they asking, and ultimately what kind of narratives were kind of being told from the study. were they actually being accurately representative of the communities that they were supposedly studying? Or maybe certain populations were kind of left out in some ways. Maybe they focused more on gender diversity, but there wasn't a whole lot on sexual diversity, or vice versa. So it's always important, because even with current critical appraisal tools like Grade or Joanna Briggs and so on, even though they're very useful for analyzing the validity and reliability of a study, it's definitely important to include a more queer theoretical lens to really kind of look at the sampling method. Like, did they really seek to gain more knowledge or perspectives and experiences from LGBTQIA plus communities? Like I said, unfortunately, there's been a dreadful underrepresentation of these communities in RCTs and systematic reviews as a result too. So it's kind of like a domino effect in that sense. And then as evidence-based practitioners, especially within the healthcare systems, is to make sure that you're assessing therapeutic interventions and outcomes in the context of gender and sexual equity. So even though, say, like a therapeutic intervention has been shown to be very effective in general with patients, ultimately you really want to consider, like, in terms of the studies that are showing that, are they really representing perhaps gender and sexual diversity? Like, again, are the samples that are being used or collected to assess a therapeutic intervention in terms of its effectiveness actually kind of like equitable? Is it really representing like trans folk or others? Because one of the things too, for example, with kidney transplants, actually, I recently just read how a trans man who was trying to get a kidney transplant wasn't qualifying, mainly because one of the main ways that they were measuring for like eligibility for a kidney transplant was the amount of waste product in your blood. But unfortunately, the doctors or the clinicians didn't really talk about the patient's trans identity. Instead, this man really just passed as a man, like as a cisgender man. So they didn't know that originally like born as female or assigned as a female at birth. And so they were applying standards of that waste product in your blood as if they were originally assigned at birth as a male, and probably should have used female metrics instead. And it took about a year longer for them to get the transplant, and they were almost nearly died as a result of it. So yeah, it was a really interesting story. I'll definitely send it to you if through an email follow-up for sure. It was really interesting to see. So yeah, there's just a whole bunch of other factors that we just don't necessarily consider, because even though maybe gender and sexuality don't necessarily have to apply to every single patient case that we're doing, sometimes it could be crucial in some ways that we don't really realize. So having that information is definitely valuable in a lot of ways that we don't expect. So I know we're kind of near the end of our workshop, so I kind of wanted to kind of showcase a couple different resources that have been useful in this sense to help support you in terms of your kind of like research toolkit for really addressing the needs of LGBTQIA plus communities. One is the lgbtdata.com, which actually I can provide a link to in the chat. Essentially, this is actually a really useful clearinghouse of, let's see, there we go. Really useful clearinghouse of open access data sets for LGBTQ populations, especially when it comes to sampling for gender and sexual diversities. Definitely, I would use this as kind of like a launching pad for you to develop your own sampling methods when it comes to that. When you come to really collect information in that regard, when it comes to demographic variables or anything like that, it could definitely be a really useful tool in that capacity. And then also with GASP, if you're having to do any types of like mental health or other types of assessments in that regard, GASP measures database is actually really useful. I'll provide a link to that too. Essentially, it's really useful, especially if you're doing any like social psychology type of related stuff or psychological type of work within your type of research. It just has a whole host of different assessments in that regard that are very useful, very tailored towards LGBTQ needs and experiences and so on. So very useful in that regard. And then also as an evidence-based practitioner, especially if you're looking for like general information or just at least trying to get a better understanding or introduction to LGBT health needs and so on, Medline Plus is actually really useful. It's like an encyclopedic tool in that regard. I'll provide a link to it as well. But yeah, it actually has a whole list of different populations, one of which is LGBT populations and communities, and it kind of provides some summarized information, really high quality evidence that gets updated very frequently, very similar to Dynamed, but this is like kind of a more openly accessible tool, and it's actually really great for patient education as well. So if you're working with patients and want to kind of like provide them with educational resources, Medline Plus is actually very useful in that regard too. But it also provides you access to like different types of relevant research, clinical trials, and so on. So really useful in that regard. But ultimately, what I kind of want to leave you with, especially when we have a couple minutes left, is that enough? Essentially, even though we have a few resources here, I would probably argue it's probably not enough for us to provide truly equitable care. I think this is going to be an ongoing practice and ongoing work and project for all of us to kind of collaborate and share our knowledge and really kind of advance these discussions further. Because again, even though we have resources like this, there's very few actually out there that are fully dedicated to LGBT needs or even needs in terms of intersecting identities, like consider like, queer, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and so on. So definitely those voices and experiences definitely need to be highlighted way more. And so it's all really up to all of us to really kind of identify, create, and share resources in that regard. So, but yeah, I think that would be kind of a good question to kind of leave us at in terms of this workshop. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the session. I hopefully it provided some sort of insight to help you with your own evidence-based practice, or whether it's to do with your own research, or maybe just kind of provide an inspiration to really kind of think about this further with your own self-studying and so on. But yeah.